out. But because I went to the SAP world, because I became a programmer, it's taken me all around the world. Obviously, at the moment, there's not much scope for global travel,
Companies
but this situation won't
SAP.
last forever. And I've got no doubts that in the future, I'll be traveling around once more. And if you go into this career, it could happen to you in the future. I'll be traveling around. When it comes to the always on demand thing, I mentioned COBOL. That's been a language since the 50s, I think. And I think it was only last year that it wasn't the most used language in the whole world by lines of code that are run every day in systems. So that's lasted 70 years approximately. I know that sounds crazy, but that's the way it is. So if a language like that can last, then ABAP is not going away anytime soon. It wouldn't go away even if they stopped developing it tomorrow, which they're not. So I think there's a little bit of job security that you can say is a virtual certainty in the ABAP world. Lastly, on this slide, the ABAP programming community. There's a website, the SAP community, and there's so many blogs and so many useful articles every single day posted there. That's great to benefit from, but it's also good to contribute to. And there's also a bucket load of open source ABAP projects that are hosted on GitHub. And once again, you can have any of them for free, but it's more fun to give than to receive. So it's a two-way thing. There's lots of goodies to be had for nothing, and lots of goodies you can contribute to too. So for anyone starting out, there's 3 steps to this. Of course, I'm going to plug the micromanagement site as a place where there are ABAP courses. Of course, I'm going to plug that because some of them are mine. Of course, learning things is all good, but you've got to use it for real. Because if you don't use knowledge that you've learned, it'll start to fade away from your memory almost at once. So once you know something, if you're already lucky enough to be employed, that's great. You can use it in your day-to-day job. If not, there are trial systems around where you can practice at the very minimum. Last, and is the most important point, is to stay up to date. Some people would rather die than learn in their spare time. But in actual fact, if you don't learn in your spare time, that's sort of dying professionally. I know some consultants who deliberately work only like 4 days a week and give 1 day a week for self-improvement. You think that's crazy, they're sacrificing 20% of their income. But it's those sort of consultants that end up earning a lot more than the ones who don't do that. You don't have to go that far. But what I would say is it is important to stay up to date. Things change so often. Every week, there's a major new announcement, I'd say. I learn something new that's happening in the ABAP world every single week. It's important to stay up to date because otherwise, I don't know, if you don't, in a couple of years' time, you go for a job interview and they ask some new acronym that's been invented recently. They'll say, oh, you could say even nowadays, they say CDS views, ARP, I'd say. I learned CDS entities, what's that? Every single week. And it's important to know. So it's important to stay up to date. Otherwise, of course, I'm going to plug myself. I've only got 1 course live at the moment on the micromanagement platform, and that's test-driven development with ABAP, which is one of my favorite subjects, and I consider pretty much vital for programming. And the good news is you can access that course for nothing, because here we have a magic code which gives you a 100% discount. And you've got that until the 7th of October. So anyone, make a little note of that code, and you can access the course on the micromanagement system for absolutely nothing. So I'd encourage, naturally, I'm going to encourage you all to do that. And later on this year or early next year, I'll have another course all about exception handling. In essence, my long-term plan is to take all the subjects in my books and turn each chapter into a much longer course on a micromanagement platform, because on an e-learning course, you can cover much more detail than you ever could in a chapter of a book. Before I take the questions from everyone listening today, I'd just like to answer some questions that people have already asked. I alluded earlier that when people popping out of university, they've learned not ABAP usually, but something like Java or JavaScript, and it's perceived as cool to to use one of that. But as I mentioned, a few years ago, I would have said that probably is the future. But since the advent of ABAP in the cloud, things have subtly changed. Before, if you wanted to do custom enhancements to the S/4HANA system, it would have to be in a language like Java or JavaScript. You wouldn't have any choice whatsoever. But now you can use those. You can use ABAP to do those enhancements as well. Moreover, I would say, in actual fact, you should learn both JavaScript and ABAP. This way, you become what's known as a full stack of pancakes developer. That sounds odd, but what that means is that you can program in the front end, the user interface side, like UI5, for example, and the back end in ABAP. And that would, if you can do both, that gives you a gigantic advantage. Next question. What should I do to prepare for a career as an ABAP programmer? Well, apart from, obviously, the micromanagement, there are 3 SAP Inside Track events. In better days, they happen all around the world. At the moment, naturally, they're all virtual, as indeed is SAP TechEd. But the point is, on all these virtual events, as they are now, you can listen to a great deal of free presentations. You could also do a lot worse in checking all the blogs about ABAP development on the SAP community website. There's a lot of new ones every single day. One question people ask me is, what's the point in learning anything, any technology that SAP comes out? Because it's all declared obsolete before 99% of people have even heard of it. Now, this question clearly relates to technologies like the Business Object Processing Framework, BOPF, or CDS Views. A lot of people haven't heard of either, and they've both already been replaced. They're both technically obsolete. However, in every case, when such a technology is replaced, the concept behind it remains identical. So if you did learn the BOPF, for example, it wouldn't have been wasted. Your learning wouldn't have been in vain, because what you learned before could be applied to the replacement technology. Next question about SQL script. People ask, is that anything to do with ABAP? If so, should I learn that? Well, SQL script is a different language. It's one that runs inside the HANA database in what's called a store procedure. Code written in SQL script, however, can be called and debugged from within the ABAP system. Since that language is intended to solve problems that ABAP cannot, the answer to whether to learn SQL script is a resounding yes. It's one more pancake on your full stack. Those are the questions that were asked before this started. And now I'm going to go on to the difficult bit and ask anybody who's listening, what is it you would like me to answer? Obviously, I have no idea what you're going to ask, but I hope I know what I'm talking about, so I can hopefully answer anything you may wish to know.
And anyone who's listening, you can go ahead and type your questions in. Just because we have so many people listening, we don't want competing background noises. So there's a question tab. Oh, great! Someone just popped in. Paul, so they said REST versus SOAP.
Okay, I can certainly tell you SAP's opinion on this matter. If you'd asked 5 years ago, it would have definitely been SOAP. That was the underlying protocol. But SAP, as in the saying, it's a woman's privilege to change her mind. And it's the same, SAP would apply the same principle to itself. It sometimes makes 180-degree changes in its opinion. And it's gone from recommending SOAP as a protocol for communication to REST. Hence, the so-called ABAP RESTful programming model, which has already changed its name. Once it was the RESTful ABAP programming model, now it's the ABAP RESTful programming model, ARP. But you can tell by the name, because it's got RESTful in the name, it's a clue. It's a clue as to what SAP direction is. And yes, so that's their opinion. I think we've got something about. I can't really see that question. I'm probably pressing the wrong button.
Yeah, Paul, I'll read that one to you. They said they heard that the programming model for Fiori is different than from ABAP RESTful programming. What is the exact difference?
Yes, it is. It is different. But as I alluded to earlier, the concepts are exactly the same, but the components of it are different. I'll start from the user interface and work backwards. In both cases, the programming model for Fiori and the ABAP RESTful programming model, the user interface, you'll be happy to know, is both UI5 based. That layer is completely unchanged, but everything below it is different. A good example is the business logic, for example, in the ABAP model for Fiori, it's the business object processing framework is used for the create, read, update, delete methods of objects like sales orders. That's completely changed in the new world. In the new world, basically everything is based on a CDS view. There's a special sort of CDS view which has behavior built into it, and that generates a special sort of ABAP class, which has got the words behavior written in a definition. And so the business object processing framework is basically not there anymore. And the idea is that basically the definition is written in a CDS view, both of the not only the database access, but also the nature of behavior, what actions or user commands it can have. And that is used to, as I said, to generate a class where you do your ABAP coding. The second difference is in the model for Fiori, how you expose that to the internet so UI5 can access it and be aware of it, is transaction SCGW in the ABAP system. Once again, in the ABAP RESTful programming model, SCGW is not there anymore. Again, it's called a service definition, service implementation. It's the same thing. It's just done slightly differently and probably slightly simpler in my mind. Once again, in essence, the concepts are identical. It's just that the technologies to do basically every step of the way have changed. That's the essence. And what we've got now is what's called an object generator, where all the different layers can be generated all at once. And you start off with a definition of like two tables, say, that are linked together. You press a magic button and it generates all different parts of the pie, the bit that does the database access, the CDS view that does that, the class that handles behavior, and the service that exposes it to a UI5 front end.
And Paul, Srinivas, who asked that question, said that they're surprised that CDS views will be obsolete and asked what the replacement will be.
Yes, this is very new. This is only happening within the last couple of months, right? And again, the concept of the CDS view is not going away, because it was the most important thing that SAP had ever done, and it was supposed to be vital to the future of the world. But they're not going to be CDS views anymore. They're going to be CDS entities, right? And you might think, what in the world is the difference? Well, if I was going to be facile, I'd say that a CDS view is database independent. Right? You could have a CDS view on an Oracle database or a Microsoft one. However, they're going to be obsolete, and a CDS entity only works with HANA. So what we've gone from the stage where ABAP queries were open SQL, which worked on any database, and we have CDS views that worked on any database, and ABAP managed database procedures, which only worked on HANA. In the future, it's not open SQL, it's ABAP SQL, because it only works on HANA. It's not a CDS view, which works with any database. It's a CDS entity, which only works with HANA. And ABAP managed database procedure, of course, only works with HANA. I suppose it was inevitable, as soon as SAP announced that S4 HANA would only work with HANA, that they ditch all the database agnostic technologies. It's what made them famous in the first place, but it's not their direction anymore. But that's a subtle difference. It's a name change. SAP like renaming things. CDS view becomes a CDS entity, and it's not database independent. But apart from that, it hasn't changed a great deal, and it's still the cornerstone of the ABAP programming in the future.
Awesome. And we have one more question coming in from Alexander. They said, test-driven development, your tips for writing tests for procedural programs reports. And they also said that they're looking forward to your book on this later this year.
This is good. I'm very happy that came up, because it's what I've been doing for the last couple of years in real life, because most people don't have the luxury of dealing with object-oriented new code. Most ABAP programmers, their day-to-day job is dealing with 20-year-old procedural programs. And they're very difficult to test because all the business logic is mixed in with the UI logic, mixed in with database access logic, all in one big lump. And it's very difficult to test. It's impossible to test that, in fact. But it needs to be done because those old programs, they're business critical and they're very fragile because a change to one area breaks a change to somewhere else almost every time. I know this has been the bane of my life for 20 years. I have 2 such monstrosities of programs to look after. And it's a nightmare. You change one thing, it breaks something else. So we've got to turn that around. And instead of the program dominating you, we've got to dominate it. And again, I'm writing a book about the entire process, but in essence, the trick is to write new code in one place that links into the old program. This concept's called an island of happiness. I got that from that term from SAP. And all new code gets written in one or more classes, which has unit tests for everything. That's why it's happy. And it gets called by the old code in the same way a function module would or a user exit would. Nothing new or radical there. And every time, I'm doing this for real, so it's not just an academic exercise. Every time I have a new requirement to add to one of these monstrosities, or every time I have to change something in one of those monstrosities, I either write the new code in my said island, or I move some existing code, not very much, but a little bit into that island and change it there in a test first manner. So as time goes by, I've got more and more code from the old program in my new area, which is full of unit tests. This way, you don't have to do a gigantic wholesale rewrite of the existing program, because that would A, take forever, and B, be really risky. And that's nobody wants that. We don't want to be really risky. We want to do the opposite. We want to reduce risk. And doing the new stuff in a different area, that's the way forward. So I'm writing a book about this, which goes into enormous detail on how to do this, technically and the workflow. But that's the basic theory. And it's not just a theory because I'm actually doing it, and it actually works. I just like to mention. Now we've got something about BOPF.
Yep, it says, does the behavior definition and behavior implementation have the concepts of validation, action, determination, just as BOPF?
The answer is yes. This thing is still absolutely brand new. Even in 2018, or when I went to Waldorf to see the first version of the ABAP RESTful programming model, determination and validations weren't there. They are now. That's the thing about these cutting edge technologies. They're not yet mature, shall we say. But now the principles are exactly the same. They're just built into classes. You've actually got things like the word action for user commands, the word derivation, it's called, and the word validation. Things actually part of the language, part of message definitions. So it's just like the concept. It's just like the BOPF. In some ways, none of these concepts are new, because even when you wrote DynPro programs using screens and things, you were still doing validations and derivations. You just didn't call them that. It was just the PVOs were generally deriving values, and the process after inputs were generally validating what had just been done. BOPF made that a bit more explicit, but sort of hid it in a big framework. In the ABAP RESTful programming model, in those behavior classes, it's more explicit still because it's actually built into the method definitions and what have you. You can clearly say, oh yes, this method is a definition, this method is validation, this method is action or user command. And also they've got yet another concept, which I don't know if it was explicitly mentioned in the BOPF. And this is where you want a field to be mandatory or grayed out based on certain logic. SAP now call that, was it a featured toggle or something like that? I don't know, it's some really strange name, but if you ever hear that, if they talk about feature control or something, that's what they mean. They're talking about graying out fields or making them mandatory. And that's sort of elevated to the same level as determinations and validations.
It looks like there's a clarifying question as well. They said, just to understand, for RESTful ABAP, do we still have to use OData publish annotation, or is there a new way to have it as a service?
It does still use OData. That's quite clear. There's how can I best describe this? I'd say there's a new the replacement for SEGW, which always used OData, is, well, again, it's called a service definition or some such. And at the moment, you specify the protocol, and it's like the Model T Ford, any color you want as long as it's black. Specify the protocol, and you've got a choice of OData, and that's it. Which presumably means that at some point in the future there could be some other protocol. The other interesting thing, at that point, you also specify the nature of the consumer. Is it going to be a user interface with a human on the other end, or some sort of machine, as in Internet of Things perhaps, or another computer system with no humans in the way? That was something you didn't specifically mention in SEGW, but it's a question you're asked in the ABAP RESTful programming model. So at the moment, as I said, you've got OData. I think it's OData version 2 or OData version 4 at this point, which paves the way for the protocols in the future, but I'm not sure SAP's in any hurry to give up on the OData at this point. I think they'll be sticking with it for a long time. Okay, anything else?
I don't have any more coming in on my end, but right now, if anyone has a last question, feel free to type that in quickly. But questions asked were great. Thank you, Paul.
Okay, no worries. That's all. As I said, if anybody comes up with something later, I'm sure they could email me or something. I don't know.
And just so everyone knows, this will be on our YouTube channel. So to get the code again, that information will be there, and it's through October 7th. So
Again, I'd like to, if it's free, I would really advise you to do it, because I think test-driven development is one of the most important things in the software world, and it hasn't been adopted in ABAP world hardly at all, which is a huge pity. It's got such a big benefit it can give to everybody.
And you know what, Paul, you're popular man. Some more questions are coming in. We have one question coming in from YouTube. And they asked, what does the future hold for SAP's master data governance and consolidation products?
Well, I know master data governance is something that's well, not quite dear to my heart, but something I'm very familiar with, because I just spent a year and a half sitting in a room with a guy who did master data governance pretty much all day, every day. And I have to tell you now, he hated the product. But that being said, there's a big demand for it, and that's crystal clear. And there's a lot of work going into it. That because if the guy who sat opposite me moaned about it all day and every day, that has to mean there's room for improvement. And I have been on the inside of SAP and even talked to the lady who's in charge of that area, and they've got a lot of people working on it. And here's a fun fact about master data governance. It was one internally of SAP. It was one of the prototypes for the ABAP RESTful programming model. Amazingly, you wouldn't ever see that in the end product, but that's just something that's under the hood. But the point is that it's they're applying the latest technologies to it. They haven't given up on it, as it were. So I think it's got a bright future. And as my friend would say, the only way is up for that product. After consolidation, I'm not so sure about that. I haven't had much dealings with that product, so I've got absolutely no idea.
Okay, we have 2 more questions coming in. First one is, let's see, let me pull this up for you. Do you see, and I'm sorry if I'm saying this incorrectly, if it's an acronym or not, do you see the real benefit of RAP programming going forward?
Well, I tell you something, it's when you first encounter the concept, it seems really, really strange. So many old things about it. The most obvious is that the global classes appear empty. All the work is done in local classes. And that seems really, really strange. It's completely opposite to everything that we've always done. And I was very puzzled by that sort of thing at the start. But it makes a bit more sense once you think about it, just because of the nature of how it works. You don't want anything outside of the RAP actually calling the methods. So if everything is essentially private, then why not make it local? That way it's completely isolated from anything else that might call it. Now, is there a future in this? The problem, of course, is with anything that's new, there's going to be people fighting back and saying, "No, this is no good." All right, bring back the way we've always done it. And sometimes SAP makes slight concessions in that area. But to be honest, I think this is actually going to be the way forward. Certainly for anything to do with business objects is a horrible term because it means different things. It's even a company that SAP bought. But what I mean by business object here is something like a sales order or a customer, or the sort of entity is how it's called in SAP. It's the sort of thing that used to be accessed by a ABAP and the BOPF was supposed to represent. And certainly for things like that, the ABAP RESTful programming model is definitely the way forward. Right? And even for things like reports, they're not a good fit, because the report doesn't have create, read, update, delete options. It's not a business object in any way, shape, or form, but it works with such things because it'll be a list of sales orders or a list of so a report will be a layer on top of all these different objects. That's the way. So the RESTful ABAP programming model will be a major, and in fact or the only way of handling both what I call transactional programs, which update or change business objects, and reporting programs, which report and interact with those business objects. I think it is the future, and it's going to be a very painful transition. There are people who are not used to it, but there's no way out of it, and it's basically have to get used to it, and it'll keep changing because it's evolving really, really quickly. And what that means is that some things that are coming in right now, they'll look different in a year. That's the problem you've got with anytime you have a look at a cutting edge technology, is that it goes in bits and starts. There'll be something that comes out tomorrow, for example, and it'll go away again in 6 months. But as I keep saying, the underlying concepts will remain the same, even if the actual way of doing it will keep changing.
And we have 3 questions, and just so everyone knows, we will stop on the hour, so we'll try to get through these ones. And I'm getting a lot of notes as well, Paul. If anyone was to have further questions for you or they wanted to connect, is LinkedIn the best place to do that?
Yes, absolutely. I'm definitely on LinkedIn. That's no problem whatsoever.
Okay, great. So yeah, so I know there's been a few askers of that question, so thank you for offering that up. And then I'm going to go from the first question we have. So what would you say are the benefits of using Eclipse instead of SE80? Also, which do you prefer?
Okay, once again, moving to Eclipse initially is really painful. Myself and my colleague, we've made a vow that we started off by having Eclipse Fridays, where we only programmed in Eclipse on just 1 day a week on a Friday, and forced ourselves to it, no matter how much we hated it. And after a while, it's not as bad as it seems, because really you can do everything you can do in SE80, you can do there. It's just that the keys are different, and that takes a lot of getting used to. A good example is in SE80, you double click on something for forward navigation, double click on a data element and you're there, double click on a method, you're in it, and it's F3 in Eclipse. That's because every other language, apart from ABAP, uses F3 to drill down on things, and we're used to double clicking. But things like that, it's not the end of the universe, and you get used to it. Once you've got used to that, there are benefits. 2 I can think of straight away is the auto generation of local methods. You can't do that in SE80. You can auto generate a global method, but if you write a call to a local method in SE80 and double click on it, nothing happens. In Eclipse, however, it will generate the definition and the implementation for you, empty skeletons, of course, but that makes it a lot easier, especially when you're doing unit tests. Doing unit tests is 10 times easier in Eclipse than it is in SE80, just purely because it's using local methods. The other thing I really like in Eclipse is extracting methods. You've got a bunch of code that's repeated all over the place. What you can do in Eclipse is you can highlight it all and press a button, and that bunch of code will get extracted into its own method, and it's clever enough to know, it'll look at the variables in that bunch of code you've highlighted and think, okay, this needs to be an importing parameter, this needs to be an exporting one, this needs to be a local variable within the method. And it's amazingly clever. It doesn't always get it right, but it gets it right 99% of the time. And that's really good for breaking up incredibly long routines into more manageable chunks, shall we say. So that's good for refactoring really old programs. The other good thing about Eclipse is if there's something you don't like or something that's missing, you can add it yourself a lot easier than well, it's almost impossible to do that in SE80. If there's something missing there, you've got to wait until SAP come out with a new version. You can't build your own plugin, for example. So in the end, I have to say that I'm becoming down on this on the side of Eclipse. It's a difficult learning curve right at the start, purely because all the buttons are in different places. But all the little extra things you can do make a big difference. Let's put it that way. And the plugins people keep coming out with to make life easier and easier. At the start, you probably take longer to do the same things. After a couple of weeks, though, you probably won't want to go back. But you've got to force yourself to do it. That's the difficult bit.
All right, next question is, SAP is building up capability in development of SAP Geospatial and are consuming those in ABAP. Is that a good thing for ABAP?
Well, I would have to say so, because I know what it's like when it's not there. For the last 20 years, the company where I work has depended on geospatial data. And amazingly, we picked the right horse. 20 years ago, we picked Esri as our partner there. And we've had a interface for all those years with Esri. They're just, if those who never heard of Esri, their bread and butter is geospatial data. That's what they do, maps. And what have you. Well before there was Google Maps and things like that. That's what Esri did. And we've had a interface with them and all that, and it's all well and good, but it's still always a bit clunky and takes far too long. So when I heard that Esri were partnering with SAP and Esri was going to use a HANA database, I thought, this problem is going away. And thus it was. And that was a really good thing, I have to say. We needed geocodes for my company. We needed to know where everything was to optimize routes and get things where they need to go in the fastest way. And anything that can make that easier is a good thing. And if it can be done natively from ABAP, so much the better. That's all I've got to say.
Very good, Paul. Okay, so we have two final questions. So I'll read you them separately because it's both are on a bit different of topics. So the first one, the attendee is saying that they haven't worked on an S4 HANA project yet, and they want to know what's the difference for ABAPers on S4. What preparation should they do for that?
Okay, well, that's good. There's big difference with S4 HANA is every other change you've made has been an upgrade, and SAP have gone out of their way to make sure everything is downward compatible. S4 HANA is not downward compatible. It's not an upgrade. It's a new system. It's a new product. SAP are very clear about this. It's not a new version of SAP. It's a different ERP system. So in effect, it's a re-implementation. Now that sounds really scary. You still have SAP tools to do the conversion, but there's a lot of things that are different, and there's a lot of things that aren't there in S4 HANA. Your custom code calls things like, I don't know, should we say credit control and SD? Right, that's not there. There's something else that does the same thing, but the chances are a lot of your code isn't going to work. So it's vitally important to do a remote check, which you can do right now. How you do it is you need to get a standalone system, which is 7.52. Some companies are lucky that their basis people can provide them such a system. If not, you can get one for nothing from the cloud appliance library from SAP. And I said it's a temporary system that only lasts a little while. And then from there, you can run a remote check on your current system to see what will break in S/4HANA. And I have to warn you, it will be a lot. We got like 56,000 warnings, for example. That sounds terrible, but the good news is it's the same 5 types of problem again and again and again and again. So it's not the end of the world. But when you first see the results, it's pretty scary. I will say it's going to be a lot more difficult than any upgrade you've done up till now. It's because some things aren't there. Let's put it that way. And as you might have heard, in S/4HANA, there's a lot of database tables that aren't there. That won't cause a syntax error, because how they've done it is when a table isn't there, like BSIK, for example, doesn't exist, they've created an identically named view with the same name, which there's a CDS view behind it, which reads the same data, so the program will still compile and will probably give you the same result. But it's worth checking. The only other point I'd like to make when you move to S/4HANA is if your ABAP code is written badly in the current system, it'll perform 1,000,000 times worse in the new system, because HANA database can be really, really fast, but it's unforgiving for bad code. The good example is select star. That can cause minor problems in an Oracle database. It can cause catastrophic problems in a HANA database. So there'll be a lot more work in an upgrade to S/4HANA than there has been traditionally. It's not the end of the world, but the good news is you can start right now, even if you're not upgrading for the next 5 years. You can do a remote check now, and it'll tell you some things you can change right now, right on the spot, that won't have any negative impact on your current system, but will avoid problems in the future. The other good news is after you've upgraded to S/4HANA, you can run an ATC check, and it goes through all the code in there, and there's a whole bunch of things that it highlights and says, like, oh, you need to change this, you need to change that. Do you want me to change it for you? And a good example is sorting tables, because in an Oracle database, things come out in the order of the primary key. In HANA, they certainly do not. And often your code relies on it being sorted by the primary key. So it'll say, oh, do you want me to add the order by primary key where it's appropriate? Yes, and it'll fix all 6,000 problems just like that. And it's about, at the moment, 10 other similar problems that can be auto-fixed. So there's a lot of things to be changes. Some of it can be automatically fixed, and that's good news.
We have a good general question coming in. Someone from Facebook is saying that they're looking at a career in SAP. Would you suggest becoming specialized in ABAP development?
I would say yes. Though one important thing, one thing that will set you above everybody else, as I mentioned earlier, is if you are not afraid to look at the user interface level as well, i.e. JavaScript. It's important to be able to know both, because SAP is not an ABAP only world anymore. A lot of people wish it was, but it's just not the case. I myself, I'm interested in, I've learned JavaScript, I've learned a whole bunch of other stuff. ABAP's still 95% of what I do. But it's important to be at least conversant with everything else, just because you're going to be dealing with things in other languages, and you don't want to be, if you don't have to be dependent on other people, it makes life so much easier.
Okay, so we have 2 more, so probably with our time limit. Firstly, we won't have any more time for more questions than these 2, but again, everyone can enroll in your course, connect on LinkedIn if they want to chat further.
Yes.
I'll read you this last one, and then we can follow up if we have time with our second question. So this one says, custom code migration tools are standard, but there are customers who have millions of lines of code. What would you suggest if they want to adopt Clean Core?
Well, again, Clean Core means different things. SAP would say that Clean Core is to have the cloud version of S/4HANA with no custom code at all, and that's nice and clean. But it's, for most companies, that's not really viable. The best analogy I gave is a clean house, for example, doesn't mean an empty house. It just means that the things inside it are tidy. So you can still have what I call a clean ABAP system by tidying up all your Z code. And in my mind, that's still a clean core, even though you still have Z things going on. It's just a question of adopting the so-called clean code principles. And while I'm on that subject, I was incredibly happy that SAP came out last year with the clean code for ABAP guidelines, which you can see on GitHub, and even automated checks. I would advise you to look at the GitHub, look up Code Pal for ABAP, which you can download some ACC checks to your system, and that will check your ABAP code according to some of the principles of the Clean Code book by Robert Martin. And as I said, there's a huge style guide of the same name called Clean ABAP, which you can Google. And both of those initiatives are really, really good when it comes to what I call getting a clean ABAP system.
Okay, great. And very last question. So they are asking where they should start with development. They said they understand that it depends on scenarios, but their understanding is that they start with OpenSQL, then HANA views, CDS, and then AMDP in that order. So they're wanting to know your thoughts on that order.
I would say yes. That is the exact same order, because you don't fly before you can walk, as the saying goes, because they all use SQL, all 3 of them too. And so you might as well start with it's not OpenSQL anymore, it's ABAP SQL, but it's the same principle. That is a way to start, because, as I say, it's easiest. Then CDS views, or entities as they're going to be, adds a whole bunch of other concepts onto that, which aren't directly related to SQL, like annotations, and so on and so forth. And ADMP adds a completely different language as well, the SQL script. But nonetheless, it's a path that should be followed in the order given. SQL, then CDS, then ADMP. You need all 3, but one at a time. Easiest first.
Thank you so much, Paul. That was our very last question. They said, awesome, thanks as well for responding to that question. So you are a wealth of knowledge. This has been fantastic. So thank you so much.
So I'm sure I'll get a whole bunch on LinkedIn tomorrow, and that's just fine. That's not a problem.
And if anyone has questions about the code or the course, we also have a live chat on micromanagement. So yep, they said, thank you. Please do more of these sessions. We can definitely do that. So we also, if you come onto our website, or you can also check our YouTube channel. You'll see that we live stream each of these. We do have one Q&A scheduled every month. So next month it will be with Nicole Land. She is a sales and distribution and materials management expert. So it will be a different topic, but we will be having them every month. So you can check back, ask us if you have any questions. But thank you, Paul. You are incredible, and we're lucky to have you as an instructor.
Oh, good. Thanks a lot.
No problem. Take care.